For a percentage of people with borderline personality disorder, but not all, there can be a higher propensity toward aggression, and that aggression can often lead to various forms of violence. And what's really important to know about this too, that I think some people minimize too much in these relationships, is that when somebody with BPD is triggered to emotional dysregulation and begins to rage, that in that rage there is verbal abuse and emotional abuse and perhaps other elements of forms of abuse, that in and of themselves that rage is aggression and is a manner of violence. And the more verbal abuse and rage and the more intense that it is manifested by a man or a woman with BPD, that it is a big red flag, number one sign that this borderline raging, verbally abusing you can definitely escalate suddenly to violence and acting out. A rage in itself is acting out, but acting out even to the next step. So the verbal abuse housed within borderline aggressive rage, even before we maybe get to more violence than the rage itself is a big warning sign that somebody could escalate to physical violence. 5 core reasons why people with BPD are more aggressive, or many can be. So first of all, I just need to say that violence in people with BPD, there's a lot of research demonstrating that both men and women have committed violent acts. With violent acts in borderline personality disorder, somewhat elevated rates of that from the general population. But this doesn't necessarily mean that anybody diagnosed with BPD, or everybody, is going to be violent. The first reason why people with BPD, which in and of itself, that diagnosis does not indicate necessarily that everyone with BPD is going to be violent or anything. But what was the number one factor associated with violence in borderline personality disorder? Well, that borderline personality disorder is a disorder that has, perhaps more so than most others, many more potential comorbidities, which again doesn't mean that every person with BPD will have, certain comorbidities or several of them. But some comorbidities include anxiety, in a smaller percentage of people with BPD, antisocial personality disorder, and substance abuse, and these all raise the risk of violence. And the second kind of driver or reason for violence in some but not all with BPD is the strong emotions that people with BPD feel. And there are so many reasons why people with BPD are more likely to be violent in their relationships, because people with BPD often are victims of violence themselves, such as through child abuse. And it's not true for all people with BPD, but many have learned to use aggression to deal with strong emotions because adults in their childhood modeled that behavior for them when they were young. But the key thing here is, we're not excusing this at all. These are just a few reasons why many people with BPD could be violent, but not all that many actually are. It varies from person to person with BPD, and it includes men and women with BPD. And the third biggest reason for people, some or many with people with BPD being violent, is that they experience this unstable sense of self and difficulty trusting others in interpersonal relationships. And they may experience very strong emotions that they believe they are being rejected or abandoned. And that's the rejection sensitivity and abandonment sensitivity in BPD. So sometimes for some people, whether male or female with BPD, intense feelings of rejection can lead to aggressive behaviors. And a fourth reason is people with BPD often have difficulties with impulsive behaviors. When they're experiencing strong emotions, that's a pretty key thing, in aggression and violence in some with BPD. So they're experiencing strong emotions that are typical of BPD. They may do things without thinking about the consequences. If they engage in violence, it's usually not planned. It's an impulsive act done in the heat of the moment, which doesn't make it any better. So there is a link between borderline personality disorder and violence and aggression, which can lead to violence, but it isn't possible to predict whether one person with BPD will be violent versus another, male versus female with BPD. So many people with BPD never commit any aggressive acts during their lives. And a fourth thing that can be a driver of aggression and therefore more often than not impulsive violence to varying degrees, right, in men or women with BPD is just when they feel engulfed in a relationship and triggered to the engulfment anxiety, they have an extreme need to get away. It's a very defensive response, very protective. It has more to do with their triggered dysregulated emotion, feelings, and re-experiencing of the unconscious repetition compulsion cycles. So if a person with BPD was really feeling the need to flee, to escape, to have space, but they don't know how to really deal with those things. When I say when they feel like fleeing, it doesn't mean it's because of you. It's what they're experiencing inside due to triggers. And if for some reason they can't get out fast enough, or you're trying to talk to them, or perhaps the odd time a person just takes their arm gently or kind of stands in a doorway for a minute or two, again, their defensive and really impulsive need to get away from what they're perceiving and re-experiencing unconsciously inside, that could also lead to aggression and or violence. And I think that the fifth that can also really be a trigger that leads many, not all, with BPD to be aggressive and impulsively violent, and this could include physical assault or worse, but it's often throwing things, raging, maybe pounding a wall, those kind of things, which are violence as well. Another factor in that is just when they feel engulfed in their own shame. And that might be when they've already behaved in a poor manner and they're feeling shame, and then their emotions escalate because they don't know how to handle what that feeling is, or they're not consciously aware of what it is, and then they get more aggressive. And it's again in a reactionary to their own triggers and perceptions, not necessarily you. It's a reactionary kind of overprotective response again that can lead to aggression and or violence in some with BPD, and not all. And I think the last sign that's really important here too is that people with BPD can often, again, in a reactionary to their own triggered emotional dysregulation, be feeling like in the repetition compulsion experiencing of what happened in childhood, then in the here and now, they're all these feelings internally are unconscious, but in the here and now, they are definitely misperceiving how you're communicating, or what you're trying to say, or what's happening between you and them. And people with BPD can then often be misperceiving quite a bit in the environment. And when they feel out of control, and this can happen in many different ways, but when they feel out of control, they can then often really have an intense and highly impulsive need to gain back a sense of control, which this is internal, but they play it out externally, and therefore that also can increase this aggression, impulsivity toward what can rise to violence. Different levels of violence, whether that it can culminate in physical assault or worse, and not for a large percentage of people with BPD, or the culminating in a rage that is aggressive and can lead to the violence impulsively of, like, you know, putting holes in a wall, throwing things while raging, etc. So there is definitely a lot of aggression in BPD, sometimes with comorbidities, but those are just a few reasons or the mechanisms of what can become aggression in BPD that leads to violence.